The history of the monarchy is usually told through wars, acts of parliament, and the shifting lines of succession. But there is a more intimate, visceral history hidden within the crumbling pages of palace ledgers and the grease-stained manuscripts of the royal kitchens. For centuries, the dining table was the true seat of power. It was where alliances were forged over courses of impossible complexity, where wealth was displayed through the sheer wastefulness of the ingredients, and where a king's health, and arguably the stability of the realm, hung in the balance of a single meal. To look at what kings and queens ate is to look at the very mindset of their era. We find a world where biology was defied by chefs who stitched animals together to create mythical beasts, where the line between food and entertainment was non-existent, and where ingredients we now consider repulsively inedible were valued higher than gold. These recipes were not just sustenance, they were political statements, medical prescriptions, and displays of divine right. Some of these dishes have vanished for good reason, lost to changing palates and ethical standards. Others have survived in the shadows, morphing into modern staples we barely recognize. Tonight we are opening the larder of the past to examine the strange, the dangerous, and the forgotten delicacies that once graced the most powerful tables on earth. Number 10. The Maids of Honor Tart. While many royal recipes are defined by their extravagance, this particular survivor is defined by a legend of jealousy and secrecy. The Maids of Honor tart is a puff pastry shell filled with cheese curds, jam, almonds, and nutmeg. It seems innocent enough, a staple of English tea rooms today, but its origins are rooted in the volatile court of the Tudors. Legend dictates that Anne Boleyn, then a lady-in-waiting, was eating these cakes when she first caught the eye of Henry VIII. The king, captivated by both the woman and the pastry, demanded the recipe be surrendered to him immediately. To ensure the dish remained exclusive to the royal palate, the story goes that the recipe was locked in an iron chest in Richmond Palace, and the maid who created it was imprisoned within the palace grounds, ordered to produce the tarts solely for the king. While the imprisonment is likely apocryphal, the secrecy was real. For generations, the exact ratio of warm milk, rennet, and spices was a closely guarded secret known only to a select few Richmond bakers who supplied the court. The survival of this recipe is a testament to the Tudor obsession with control, even over the smallest confection. It reminds us that in a royal court, even a simple tart could be seized as the property of the crown, transformed from a kitchen experiment into a state secret. Number 9. Mock turtle soup. If you have read Alice in Wonderland, you know the mock turtle, but the reality behind the character is a fascinating window into the 18th and 19th century class structures. Green turtle soup was the ultimate status symbol of the Georgian aristocracy. Importing live turtles from the Caribbean was an exorbitantly expensive logistical nightmare. They often died on the voyage, making the surviving creatures worth a fortune. It was a dish that screamed empire, colonization, and limitless wealth. But the lower nobility and the rising middle class wanted a taste of this prestige without the bankruptcy that followed. Enter the calf's head. Chefs discovered that if you took the head of a calf, boiled it until the gelatinous tissues dissolved, and treated it with specific wines and spices, the texture was remarkably similar to the green fat of a turtle. This wasn't just a substitution, it became a culinary phenomenon in its own right, appearing on royal menus when the real thing was unavailable or when the crown wished to appear frugal. Queen Victoria's kitchens prepared this regularly. The dish represents a unique moment in culinary history where a fake version of a luxury good became a respected classic, surviving well into the 20th century before falling out of fashion, largely because the modern palate has lost its taste for boiling animal heads. Number 8. Parmesan ice cream. When we think of ice cream today, we think of vanilla, chocolate, or fruit. But in the 18th century, ice cream was a savoury frontier. The concept of freezing custard was so novel and technologically difficult, requiring vast ice houses stocked with winter lake ice, that chefs felt no need to limit themselves to sugar. The 1789 recipe book of Frederick Nutt, which influenced royal kitchens of the era, lists a delicacy that would baffle modern diners: Parmesan cheese ice cream. This was not a dessert, it was an entremets, a course served between the roast and the sweets to cleanse the palate and shock the senses. The recipe called for grating 6 ounces of the finest Parmesan into a pint of cream, boiling it, straining it, and then freezing it in a pot buried in ice and salt. It was served in tiny ornate glasses, often melted slightly to the consistency of a chilled soup. To the Georgian elite, this was the height of sophistication, a marriage of the Italian luxury of aged cheese with the impossible luxury of frozen temperature. It survived for decades before the strict segregation of sweet and savoury courses banished it from the menu, only to be rediscovered by avant-garde chefs in the 21st century. Number 7. The beaver's tail. Religion has always dictated diet, but for medieval and Renaissance royalty, religious rules were merely obstacles to be navigated with creative taxonomy. The Catholic Church strictly forbade the consumption of meat on Fridays and during the 40 days of Lent. For a king accustomed to feasting, 40 days of vegetables and fish was an intolerable sentence. This led to a convenient biological reclassification that allowed the crown to eat red meat while technically adhering to the law. The church declared that because the beaver spent the majority of its time in the water, and because its tail was scaly and hairless, the beaver was, for culinary purposes, a fish. This theological loophole brought the beaver tail to the high tables of Europe. The tail was roasted over open fires, the scaly skin peeled back to reveal fatty, rich meat that was described as tasting somewhat like pork. It was a favourite of the nobility who wished to demonstrate their piety without sacrificing their gluttony. The recipe survived hundreds of years simply because it solved a problem. It disappeared only when the influence of the church over the royal diet waned, and the beaver populations of Europe were hunted to near extinction for their fur rather than their flesh. Number 6. Ambergris and eggs. King Charles II was a man of voracious appetites, and his favourite dish is one of the most disturbing to the modern sensibility. His preferred breakfast was a dish of scrambled eggs laced with ambergris. To understand why this is strange, one must understand what ambergris is. It is a waxy, flammable substance produced in the digestive system of sperm whales, essentially a gallstone or whale vomit that floats in the ocean for years, hardening and acquiring a complex, musky scent. Today, it is used almost exclusively in high-end perfumery and is worth more per ounce than gold. In the 17th century, however, it was a culinary spice. It was believed to be a powerful aphrodisiac and a restorative for the brain. The king's cooks would grate this grey, waxy substance into his morning eggs, infusing them with a flavour described as earthy, marine, and incredibly potent. This wasn't just breakfast, it was a flex of maritime dominance. Eating something that could only be found by chance on the beaches of the empire was the ultimate luxury. The recipe fell out of favour as ambergris became too valuable to eat, eventually moving from the kitchen to the perfume laboratory, but it remains one of the most expensive breakfasts ever recorded in history. Number 5. Lamprey pie. This is perhaps the most enduring and ominous of all royal dishes. The lamprey is a parasitic fish, an ancient jawless creature that feeds by latching onto other fish with a sucker mouth full of rows of teeth and draining their blood. To the modern eye, they are the stuff of nightmares. To the medieval monarch, they were a delicacy to die for, quite literally. King Henry I is famously recorded by the chronicler Henry of Huntingdon as dying from a surfeit of lampreys, ignoring his physician's advice to stop eating the rich, fatty flesh. Despite this royal fatality, the tradition persisted. The city of Gloucester held a royal charter that required them to send a massive lamprey pie to the monarch every Christmas. This pie was an architectural marvel, often decorated with gilded pastry and filled with the blood-rich meat of the eels, stewed in wine and spices. The tradition was so strong that it survived the changing dynasties, the English Civil War, and the Industrial Revolution. It was only paused in the 19th century due to cost, but even Queen Elizabeth II received a lamprey pie for her Diamond Jubilee in 2012, though by then the lampreys had to be imported from North America because they had become extinct in British rivers. It is a recipe that has survived not because it is delicious, but because it is a ritual. Number 4. Peacock in his pride. No dish exemplifies the theatre of the medieval banquet better than the peacock in his pride. In the era before television or cinema, the food was the visual entertainment. This recipe was less about flavour and more about taxidermy. The bird was carefully skinned, with the feathers and head left intact and attached to the skin. The carcass was then roasted with spices, usually ginger, cloves, and cumin, and once cooked, it was allowed to cool slightly. Then came the reconstruction. The cooked bird was sewn back into its own raw feathered skin. The tail was fanned out and supported by hidden wire structures. Often the beak was gilded with gold leaf, and a piece of cotton soaked in spirits was placed in its mouth and lit on fire as it was brought into the hall. The meat itself was notoriously tough and dry, often described by critics of the time as difficult to digest. But the taste was irrelevant. The purpose of the dish was to allow the king to renew his vows of chivalry over the bird, a practice known as the vow of the peacock. It survived for centuries purely as a ceremonial centerpiece, eventually replaced by the turkey, which had the distinct advantage of actually tasting good. Number 3. The Cockentrice. If the peacock was about beauty, the Cockentrice was about playing God. The Tudors had a fascination with hybridity and the grotesque, and the chefs of Henry VII and Waite obliged with this Frankenstein creation. The recipe required a capon, a castrated rooster, and a pig. The chef would cut both animals in half at the waist. They would then take the front half of the bird and sew it onto the back half of the pig, or vice versa, creating a mythical chimera to be roasted. This was not done for flavour. It was a display of technical skill, sewing slippery, raw skin so tightly that it would not burst during roasting was a masterclass in needlework. The resulting beast was stuffed, glazed with saffron and egg yolks to make it shine like gold, and served as the centerpiece of the feast. It was designed to shock and amuse the guests, a conversation starter that signalled the king's dominion over nature itself. While no one cooks Cockentrice today, it stands as the ultimate example of sautelty, the medieval art of making food look like something else, a tradition that survives in the fondant sculptures of modern cake artistry. Number 2. Whale meat. We tend to associate the consumption of whales with the distant past or specific whaling nations, but whale meat made a startling appearance on the royal menus of the 20th century. During and after World War II, Britain was gripped by severe rationing. The Ministry of Food was desperate for protein sources that were not subject to rationing coupons. They looked to the sea, and specifically to the whale. In a bid to set an example for his subjects, the king's household experimented with whale meat. It was marketed as sea beef, but the reality was far less appetizing. It had a dark, liver-like texture and a pungent, oily taste that required heavy marinating in vinegar and spices to mask. Despite the royal family's patriotic attempt to normalize it, the public never truly accepted it. It remains a fascinating anomaly, a recipe born not of excess but of scarcity, proving that even the crown was not immune to the hardships of the nation. It is a forgotten recipe because the moment rationing ended, it was dropped with immediate relief. Number 1. The live frog and bird pie. The nursery rhyme, "Sing a song of sixpence," speaks of 24 blackbirds baked in a pie. We assume this is nonsense verse. It is not. It is a literal recipe from the 16th and 17th centuries. This was the ultimate party trick of the European courts. A massive pie crust was baked empty, with a hole left in the bottom. Once the pastry was cool, live frogs or small birds were inserted into the hollow shell. When the pie was placed before the guest of honor and the crust was cut, the birds would fly out in a panic, or the frogs would leap onto the table, causing the ladies to scream and the court to erupt in laughter. The 17th century cookbook, The Accomplished Cook, by Robert May, describes this in detail, suggesting it as a way to entertain the guests. This was food as performance art, where the edible component was secondary to the chaos it caused. It fell out of favor as the definition of hygiene and cruelty evolved, but for hundreds of years, a dinner was not considered a success unless the food was literally alive. It is the ultimate forgotten recipe, a symbol of an era where dining was a blood sport. History is often written in ink, but the truest history is written in the grease and crumbs of the banquet table. These recipes tell us more than just what people ate. They tell us what they feared, what they worshipped, and how they viewed their place in the natural order. From the lethal lamprey to the stitched-together cockentrice, the royal menu was a place where the boundaries of reality were tested. Do you think these elaborate displays of food were a necessary part of maintaining power, or just the bored excesses of a ruling class with too much time on their hands? I'd love to hear your take in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the culinary archives, hitting the like button helps us uncover more stories like this from the dusty shelves of history. And for more investigations into the hidden lives of the monarchy, make sure you're subscribed. We have a video coming up on the secret medical treatments of the Victorian court that you won't want to miss. I'll see you in the next one.